Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat, and I just want to start by saying a massive thank you for all of the lovely comments that I got on last week's video about my new camera. It was really rewarding that you noticed there was a difference in the way the video looked compared to previous weeks. It was also very nice that you thought there was an improvement, because let me tell you one thing, editing your own face in 4K is quite the experience, and it's one that I hope I will at some point get used to. I'm also going to see if I can figure out a way that we can get some of the background in better focus. I am going to book an appointment with the person who sold me the camera in the hopes they can give me a tutorial, because I'm not a filmmaker by trade. I am learning all of this on the hoof, so I may need some help. Anyway, let's jump into today's topic. So I've been talking about history over here on YouTube for a fair old while now. In that time, I've talked about a lot of early modern events and Tudor people, but I do fear that I have been remiss, because just where is the video on King Edward VI? Well, it's missing, isn't it? Until now, that is. So, let's take a look at him. Before we jump into the meat of this topic, so to speak, I wonder if it might be useful for us to set up a thought experiment for us to hold on to as we explore it. And it is going to be a counterfactual history one. What if Edward VI had lived long enough that he was able to rule, fully and in his own right? What kind of king would he have been? And how might we, today, be discussing and remembering his reign? Edward was born in the Queen's Rooms at Hampton Court Palace on the 12th of October 1537. The date was an auspicious one, as it is the eve of the feast of the translation of that most famous English king and saint, Edward the Confessor, and it was this fact that inspired the choice for his name. 3 days later, on the 15th of October, he was baptised by Thomas Cranmer in the chapel at Hampton Court Palace. His father, King Henry VIII, was 46 years old, and he, once again, had a living prince. This time, and according to him, quote, conceived in most lawful matrimony. Henry could finally celebrate. Because for the first time since 1511 and the birth of the short-lived Henry, Duke of Cornwall, this king's hopes for his nation and dynasty must finally have been rekindled. The christening was an entirely splendid affair, where the great and the good could make their processional appearances. The prince's godparents were Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and Edward's 21-year-old half-sister, Mary Tudor. The infant prince was carried by Gertrude Courtenay, Marchioness of Exeter, who was the wife of Henry VIII's cousin, Henry Courtenay. Little Edward's uncles were also given places of ceremonial prominence. Edward Seymour, at that time Earl of Hertford, carried his nephew's 4-year-old half-sister, Elizabeth, while Sir Thomas Seymour was tasked with helping to hold the canopy over this most special baby's head. By the time of Edward's birth, Henry VIII had been on the throne for 28 years. The 2 women he had married before Edward's mother were both dead. The first, Catherine of Aragon, he had repudiated and exiled. The second, Anne Boleyn, he had beheaded. Their daughters, Mary and Elizabeth respectively, had both been bastardised. There had been conflict at home and abroad as Henry remade the faith of his nation in his own image, and in such a way that neither Roman Catholic nor Protestant reformer could be wholly satisfied or, indeed, sure of their safety. A year before Edward's birth, the Pilgrimage of Grace had broken out in support of the monasteries and also in support of traditional religion. I do have a video on that topic that I will leave linked. This pilgrimage would be violently put down by the government. All this is to say that it was not fully harmonious in or indeed for England at the time of Edward's birth. Additionally, I think that we can only imagine what it must have been like for Edward as he grew up, understanding, coming to terms with, the lengths that his father had had to go to, or at least as he saw it, he had to go to, in order to, in part at least, bring him into existence. And I do wonder if we're going to see evidence of this state of affairs, the legacy of these events, as we begin to explore Edward's biography. When Edward was 12 days old, his mother, Jane Seymour, died of complications that were connected to his birth. Edward would have 3 stepmothers before his 6th birthday. But around the time that Hans Holbein the Younger was preparing to travel to paint the first of these stepmothers, Anne of Cleves, that artist would most likely have been putting the finishing touches to this image of Edward. Here we see him. He appears as a robust, round-cheeked child, clad in the very finest red velvet and gold brocade. The painting also bears a Latin inscription, which was written by the special envoy to Cleves, Sir Richard Morrison. When translated into English, this inscription reads as follows, quote, "Little one, emulate thy father and be the heir of his virtue. The world contains nothing greater. Heaven and earth could scarcely produce a son whose glory would surpass that of such a father. Do thou but equal the deeds of thy parent, and men can ask no more. Shouldst thou surpass him, thou hast outstripped all, nor shall any surpass thee in ages to come." This prince's early years were spent, quote, "among the women of his nursery." This included, unsurprisingly, nurses, both wet and dry. There were rockers, and also his 2 sisters, with the prince showing an apparent preference for Mary, who, had things been different for her, might well have been expecting to have had her own little ones to care for by then. His playmates and companions would be the sons and daughters of the nobility. The Treaty of Greenwich from July 1543 provided the now 5-year-old Edward with a potential betrothed. This was his first cousin once removed, the 6-month-old Mary Queen of Scots. However, the plans that were agreed at Greenwich would soon fall apart when they were presented in Scotland, which in turn led to the so-called rough wooing. This actually refers to a period when England was at war with both France and Scotland, and this went on for years. Nevertheless, July 1543 did see the successful commencement of at least one marital union, though. This was the marriage of King Henry VIII to his 6th wife and queen, Catherine Parr. Edward's letters to Catherine show his deep affection and respect for her. He called her his Mater Carissima, meaning dearest mother. He expressed his gratitude for her, quote, loving and tender letters. As for Edward's letters and other writings, at least those that remain extant to us, they display evidence of first-class tutelage from Dr. Richard Cox. He was the headmaster of Eton and the Canon of Westminster. But also he was not alone in being tutor to Edward, because Dr. Cox was joined by John Cheek, Regius Professor of Greek at Cambridge, also Roger Ascham, who would then become the tutor of Edward's half-sister Elizabeth. And these men were joined by the courtier and humanist scholar Anthony Cook. All of these men had attended the University of Cambridge, and the University of Cambridge is often described as the cradle or nursery of the English Reformation. Thus, little Prince Edward was being educated by evangelical reformers, who, I think quite naturally, would go some way to influencing the Protestant direction that this boy's own faith path would take. The prince was not alone in his schoolroom, as he would be joined at various points by his cousins, Edward and Henry Seymour, in addition to a number of sons of prominent courtiers. Within this group were the sons of the Duke of Suffolk and his last wife, Catherine Willoughby, and I do have videos about both of those figures that I will leave linked. The boys were called Henry and Charles Brandon, and as I have mentioned in my previous videos on their mother and father, both of these boys would very sadly die in an epidemic, which is thought to have been the sweating sickness in 1551. It is said that Edward mourned their loss greatly. The prince, and then king, did, however, have an especially favoured companion, who was called Barnaby Fitzpatrick. According to various accounts, Edward was a brilliant student who flourished within the tradition of humanist education that famous thinkers like Juan Luis Vivez and Erasmus had suggested to be the ideal training ground for a Christian prince. For the nobles who obtained a place for their sons in this prince's schoolroom, it was an ideal situation. Not only would their child be on the receiving end of an education that was quite literally fit for a king, but it also placed them alongside Edward as he grew up, as he went from prince to king. It was only fair to assume that the friends that were favoured in boyhood might well expect profitable and empowering preferment in the household and or government of King Edward, from when he was able to take the governance of the realm into his own hands. And of course, it was fully expected that he would be able to do just that. Edward, first as a prince and also later as king, had a variety of topics he was to study. There were languages, Latin, Greek and French. He would read the works of great authors and thinkers like Cicero, Plato, Aristotle, Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, and Pliny the Younger. He explored and practiced rhetorical sparring. He was shaped in the practicalities of politics. He was trained in religious scripture and had a grasp of it that behooved him in his role of head of the Church of England. He was taught to play musical instruments such as the virginals and the lute. Additionally, it may be that Edward was taught the mathematics of oceanic navigation by Dr. John Dee himself. Edward was 9 years old when his father died and he became King of England on the 28th of January 1547. Edward learned of his new state the following day. He was by that time in the company of his 13-year-old half-sister Elizabeth. Reportedly, these two children clung to each other and wept at the news. Due to Edward's tender age, the realm would, of course, need a council and or a protector to maintain it while the nation as a whole waited for their king to become a man. 3 days after Henry VIII's death, Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, became Lord Protector of the realm and also Governor of the King's person. Although the King's Council did approve this elevation, there were certainly some that begrudged it, or who would come to at the very least. As was customary, this new king spent a few days before his coronation in residence at the Tower of London. On the 19th of February 1547, Edward made his way from there to Westminster. His journey was a public spectacle, as almost all journeys of this kind usually were. It was full of pageantry and entertainment. Indeed, John Gough Nicholls explains that as this procession wound its way past St Gregory's Church, which was located in St Paul's Churchyard, this king spotted a tightrope walker who, quote, played certain mysteries on the said rope, as tumbling and casting himself from one leg to another, which stayed the King's Majesty, with all the train, a good space of time. If any person watching or indeed taking part in this procession had somehow forgotten that their new king was only 9 years old, then this moment, I think, presumably, would have been a stark reminder of the fact. Eventually, though, the group did get moving again, and they would reach Westminster. They would spend the night at the palace there, and then the following day they would move into the Abbey. There, on the 20th of February 1547, Edward was crowned. When it comes to us attempting to assess Edward's kingship, I think we have to acknowledge that his age is always going to prove to be a challenge. I mean, how responsible can he ever be viewed as being with regard to things like the content and form of the 1549 Book of Common Prayer, which in part led to the rebellion of that year, or, for that matter, the policy that allowed for the enclosure of common land that in turn led to Kett's rebellion at around the same time, give or take a month, both of which occurred in 1549. We know, or have reports, that Edward voiced his opinions, but I think we do have to wonder, if those opinions did not follow the plans that his councillors had for his reign and nation, how much weight would they actually have held? Do we only hear about the arguments that he made that followed down the track of these plans? We know that Edward certainly signed warrants for executions, some of which were for his own family members, but did he do so willingly? Did he have the power to refuse to sign, to stay an execution, or even to pardon the condemned? And if he didn't, how can we judge the kind of king he was going to be based upon this kind of evidence? I think perhaps it's quite difficult. However, although it may be hard to form an opinion of the kind of king Edward might have become from looking at the use of royal power during his short reign in this way, could the glimpses we do get of his personal responses to some of these things be better? Let's find out, shall we? I'm going to pull together a few examples of Edward in his own words, so to speak, for us to take a look at now. The king's uncles, Edward and Thomas, had a dangerous rivalry, to say the least. Edward Seymour had seemingly done everything in his power to keep his brother away from wielding any real influence in this new regime. Thomas's response to this was to flirt with his nephew's sister Elizabeth and also to marry Henry VIII's sixth wife, this young king's beloved stepmother, Catherine Parr. Additionally, Thomas took to secretly bribing his way into his nephew's presence without his brother's knowledge. And when he was there, he apparently would attempt to encourage little King Edward to complain about how the Protector treated him. Good old Uncle Tommy suggested that his nephew was being kept as a, quote, beggarly king. Thus, he chose to provide him with pocket money. There is one account that asserts that once all these secret meetings were finally discovered by Edward Seymour, a prompt stop was put to them. The king now had a collection of guards around him who could apparently not be bribed, and so Uncle Tommy, as the account alleges, decided it was best for him to sneak in at night. In doing so, he surprised the king's dog, who started to bark. In response, Thomas Seymour killed the dog and fled the scene. Soon, the story became that Thomas had sought to kidnap the king on this occasion, that he wished to replace his brother in the role of protector. It was even alleged that, following the death of his wife Catherine Parr, Thomas planned to marry Elizabeth and to rule with or through her after usurping Edward himself. King Edward VI often gets credit for being the first English monarch to keep a diary. It has been suggested that this diary keeping may have begun at the instruction of one of his tutors. The diary starts with a description of this king's early life. This is followed by the events of 1547 to 1549, which are detailed in a manner that's similar to those that are found in the Chronicles. From March 1550 to the last entries in the diary, which come in November 1522, it is more like a traditional diary, made up of daily entries. The destruction of Thomas Seymour is recounted in the diary as follows. Quote, "Also the Lord Sudeley, Admiral of England, was condemned to death and died the March ensuing." This is how he records the sentencing and eventual beheading of his uncle on Tower Hill on the 20th of March 1549. Just a few months later, Edward's other uncle would be removed from his position of authority. The king records the court coup that took place with a level of coolness that is quite unmatched. We learn from his diary that, quote, "The council, about 19 of them, were gathered in London thinking to meet with the Lord Protector, and to make him amend some of his disorders. He, fearing his state, caused the secretary, in my name, to be sent to the Lords, to know for what cause they gathered their powers together, and if they meant to talk with him, that they should come in a peaceable manner. The next morning, being the 6th of October and Saturday, he commanded the armour to be brought down and out of the armoury of Hampton Court, about 500 harnesses, to arm both his and my men withal. The gates of the house to be rampaired, people to be raised. People came abundantly to the house. By February 1550, John Dudley had secured himself the positions of Great Master and Lord President. Although it went by a different name, he had in effect replaced Edward Seymour. Nearly 2 years later, on the 22nd of January 1552, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, would be executed on Tower Hill, on what are traditionally viewed as being trumped-up charges of treason. His real crime, instead, was that he resented Dudley's advancement and that he may have hoped, even planned, to pull him down. One sentence in the King's diary suffices for that day. Quote, "The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off upon Tower Hill between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning." On account of the apparent coldness in diary entries like this, Edward VI is sometimes described as being a concerningly unfeeling little boy, which of course may well be true. But perhaps it's not provably the case using just these excerpts. And I say that because this King's diary is not like the ones that we may have kept under lock and key in our childhood bedrooms. Instead, it's clearly supposed to be taking the form of a chronicle. And a chronicle is a document that was intended to be for public consumption. So, is the coldness that we find in this record, in the account in general, potentially simply evidence of what a boy thinks a king should sound like? Now, that isn't to say that there aren't disturbing accounts with regards to Edward's character, because there certainly are. Indeed, in a letter dated to the 21st of March 1551, we are given a, shall we say, tantalising account of this king's frankly disturbing behaviour. Before I go into it, I want to flag up that this event that I'm about to talk about is not one that I found being referred to elsewhere or indeed by anyone else. Nevertheless, I want to mention it. Simon Renard, the Spanish ambassador, wrote to his emperor and he included the following, quote, "Incidentally, I will add the account of an act which is said to have been committed by the King of England. He is said to have plucked a falcon, which he kept in his private chamber and torn it into 4 pieces, saying as he did so to his governors that he likened himself to the falcon whom everyone plucked, but that he would pluck them too thereafter, and tear them into 4 parts. I have heard the truth of the story certified by people whose testimony should place it beyond doubt. But, nevertheless, Ambassador Mason denies it, and accuses President Montluc of having excogitated it entirely himself. Now, of course, I can only speak for myself, but I'd imagine that I would be quite, shall we say, disconcerted if I had been one of the governors who this particular show happened in front of, if indeed it did happen. But we do also have reports of there being high conflict meetings and missives between the king and his half-sister Mary on the subject of religion, and in particular with regard to Mary's apparent refusal to conform with any of the changes that were being made by Edward and or his regime. Mary was, it seems, prepared to suffer her father's changes, albeit with a fairly bad grace, but the changes of her brother apparently were going too far. Perhaps she might have conformed had her brother been fully grown, but for now, while he was still in his minority, she felt it best that her father's settlement should be the one to endure. On the 24th of August 1551, King Edward wrote to Mary. Before we dive into the letter, let's just remind ourselves that Mary was some 2 decades Edward's senior, and on top of that, considering that he grew up in her company, she probably taught him how to use a spoon. The letter he sent read as follows, quote, "Right, dear, And right entirely beloved sister, we greet you well, and let you know that it grieveth us much to perceive no amendment in you, of that which we, for God's cause, your soul's health, our conscience, and the common tranquillity of our realm, have so long desired, assuring you that our sufferance hath much more demonstration of our natural love than contentation of our conscience and foresight of our safety. Wherefore, although you give us occasion, as much almost as in you is, to diminish our natural love, yet we be loath to feel it decay, and mean not to be so careless of you as we be provoked. And therefore, meaning your weal, which is your state, your commonwealth, your spiritual wealth, if you will, and therewith joining a care not to be found guilty in our conscience to God, having cause to require forgiveness that we have so long, for respect of love toward you, omitted our bounden duty, we send at this present our right trusty and right well beloved counsellor, the Lord Rich, Chancellor of England, and our trusty and right well beloved counsellors, Sir A.W. Knight, controller of our household, and Sir W.P. Knight, one of our principal secretaries, in message to you, touching the order of your house, willing you to give them firm credit in those things they shall say to you from us, and do there in our name. Given under our signet at our Castle of Windsor, the 24th of August, in the 5th year of our reign. Just in case anyone missed it. Wherefore, although you give us occasion, as much almost as in you is, to diminish our natural love, yet we be loath to feel it decay, and mean not to be so careless of you as we be provoked, is a threat. Mary is being warned here. Her faith, and the way she practiced it, for her brother the king, was a problem. Edward was not a sickly child. Of course, there had been illnesses, but there was by no means an established pattern of frailty. There would be problems, real problems, but they seem to have started in April 1552, with a bout of smallpox or measles or maybe both. At the start of the next year, the king was reportedly showing signs of end-stage tuberculosis, which it is thought he would most likely have contracted before the smallpox-measles cocktail. Before long, it was abundantly clear that Edward was not going to live long enough to marry and then father an heir of his own to carry on his legacy and national faith. Edward, perhaps of his own volition, possibly inspired by his advisers, set out to overwrite the 1543 Act of Succession, which had returned his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth back into the line of succession. As this came in the form of an act, it was now the law of the land. When Edward sat down to work on his device for the succession, it seems evident that he was hopeful that he might be able to put a Protestant male heir on the throne after him. The device begins with the Grey Women. The mother Frances is followed by her daughters, Jane, Catherine and Mary. These women at the start are being placed as caretakers for the throne that one of their heirs male would, of course, sit on. Now, at the time of writing this, no such male heir existed, or indeed looked likely to be on the way in the near future. To speed things along, Lady Jane Grey was married to John Dudley's son Guildford on the 21st of May, 1553. In due course, Edward must have realised that he was not going to live long enough for any son to be born to any of these women, and that resulted in the change we can see here. From the Lady Jane's heirs male to the Lady Jane and her heirs male. With these small crossings out and insertions, Jane would be the next Queen of England. Now, while John Dudley had much to gain from this state of affairs and was reported by 2 eyewitnesses to have driven it forward, Edward's agreement was fulsome, and evidence of that also comes from numerous sources. Dale Hope explains that, quote, "Nevertheless, the king's role is undeniable. When Montague, on the 14th of June, informed Edward that the execution of this device after the king's decease would be treasonable, the dying king, with sharp words and angry countenance, commanded him and all the judges to accept it. Montague complied, but only after getting the king's pardon, for he knew that as a minor, Edward could not make out a valid will, and that only Parliament could overturn the Act of 1544 governing the succession. Whereunto the king said he would have this done, and after ratify it by Parliament. And on the 19th of June, Chancery began preparing writs for a new Parliament to meet on the 18th of September. Edward regarded Jane as his spiritual sister, his only acceptable successor. But Parliament would not get the chance to meet in that September in order to make this device into a legal act of succession, because King Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1553. He was 15 years old. In the aftermath of his death, there was, as we know, an attempt to act on Edward's commands, on his desires, and so Jane was proclaimed queen 4 days later, on the 10th of July. The delay resulted from the fact that the king's death had been kept a secret, presumably so the new regime could try to set up on as firm a footing as possible. As it turned out, evidently 4 days was not sufficient. Jane's rule fell apart within 9 days. She was deposed on the 19th of the month. Now Mary, Edward's half-sister, was the Queen of England. But what do you think? Would Edward's device for the succession have potentially been respected if only he had lived long enough for an act to be able to come into force? What do you think of this king's character according to the evidence we have explored today? What kind of king might he have been if he had lived long enough to govern fully, in his own right? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video. Or you can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box, so please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends. In fact, if you like my channel, why not let some pals know about it? They might like it too, and then you can have people to talk about it with. Please also let me know if you liked this video by hitting the thumbs up, and also subscribe to the channel. If you think you're subscribed, now is the ideal time to have a little check. Make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you. And while you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop-down menu that will appear so that YouTube allegedly will tell you when I've next uploaded, or indeed when I'm planning to go live. This is also a great point to just drop a little emoji as well as a comment in that comment section down below. All engagement does really help to boost this video through the algorithm. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.